Hello everyone, welcome to another CSS tutorial. In today's video we're going to be taking a look at the z-index property. If you're not sure what the z-index property is, or when to use it, or why you're using it in the first place, hopefully we can answer those questions for you today. So let's dive right in. As you can see on the right side of your screen, we have a sample page with two boxes, a blue box and a red box. And these are nothing but divs with a class of blue and a class of red. And if we take a look at our CSS, we are just assigning these elements simple background colors and borders, heights and widths. But this is a video on the z-index property. What is the z-index property? Well, it has to do with the way that elements relate to one another when they are stacked on top of each other, when they are overlapping one another. So to illustrate this, let's position the red box so that it sits on top of the blue box by about 20-30 pixels, so that its top left corner sits about right here. Let's make that happen. So let's head over to our CSS file. We're going to be targeting the red div. Let's go ahead and also give it a horizontal offset so that it is really clear visually what's going on. And we're going to give it a negative value for margin top, negative 45 pixels. So now the red div is overlapping the blue div. Great. This is where the z-index property becomes highly relevant. Now we see that the red box is overlapping the blue box by default, and this is because it is placed later in the markup. By default, whichever element comes last in the markup is going to overlap when the elements begin stacking. But we can use the z-index property to overrule this behavior. Let's imagine we wanted the blue div to actually overlap the red div. To achieve this, we simply assign a larger or higher z-index value to the blue div than the red div. So let's give the blue div a z-index value of 3 and the red div a z-index value of 2. Now I also need to point out that the z-index value is pretty much ignored by the browser unless the elements are positioned. Now I can get into that more later, but for now we're just going to give a position relative declaration to both elements. Position relative. So if we refresh, we now see that the blue div overlaps the red div. Great. Now just a really quick note on the values we chose for these z-index declarations. With best practices in mind, we should actually use larger values. So instead of 3, we'll use 30. Instead of 2, let's use 20. The reasoning behind this is you want to leave room in between the values for incremental values. And there are no whole numbers in between 2 and 3. The reasoning for this is down the road, if we add a purple div or an orange div, we should leave room so it could have a z-index value in between these two just in case. That's really not that important, but when you get into more advanced designs, it could come into play. Now moving on. You've seen what the z-index property can do. Let's take a look at what the z-index property cannot do. So let's imagine that the red div was actually overlapping the blue div again. So let's switch these z-index values. Okay, so the red div is overlapping the blue div once again. Now let's imagine that the red div had a child element. So if we hop over to our markup, we're going to create a div with a class of orange. Okay, so if we refresh, we see that I've already created styles to create this orange box. Let's take a quick look at those. I'm using position absolute to position the orange box in the top right hand corner of the red box. Okay, now let's imagine a scenario and let's try to accomplish it with z-index. Let's imagine we want the blue box to sit on top of the red box, but we want the orange box to sit on top of all of them. So let's try to make that happen. We'll give the blue box a z-index value of 50 and the red box a z-index value of 40. Okay, so let's refresh. Okay, now we're going to also give the orange box a z-index value of 5,000. If we refresh, we see that the orange box, even with a z-index value of 5,000, is still sitting below the blue box. And this might seem counterintuitive at first, because we just learned that whichever element has a larger z-index value will overlap the other element. So how is it possible that a z-index value of 5,000 is getting overlapped by a z-index value of only 50? Well, here's the sense involved. The web browser, let's take a look at our HTML. The web browser, when it's interpreting the stack of the elements, is going to start at the topmost node. So it's going to start with the HTML node and then drill down to the body node, and then it's going to get to our blue div and our red div. So at first, it's not even going to acknowledge the orange div. It's just going to ask, between the blue div and the red div, which element should stack on top. It's going to see that the blue div has a higher z-index value than the red div. So as far as the browser is concerned, the blue div takes precedence. And because the orange div is a child of the red div, it doesn't matter that its z-index value is 5,000. All that matters is that it is a child of the red div, and its z-index value of 5,000 is really just going to determine how it is positioned amongst other children of the red div. So if we had purple and green divs inside the red div, then yes, the orange div is going to stack on top if they are overlapping. But as far as the orange div overlapping the blue div, that is not going to happen unless we change the structure of our markup. So I just wanted to get into the limitations of z-index. It's not a fix-all when you're trying to position things differently. Sometimes you are going to have to restructure your HTML. Now, before we end this video, there's something that I want to cover. I mentioned it earlier, but let's go into detail now. Z-index only applies to elements which are positioned. But what does that mean? What does it mean for an element to be positioned? Well, it means that we have a property of position and a value of either relative, absolute, or fixed. Now, I have another video covering position relative and position absolute. Let's go ahead and put this back to relative. Position fixed I can cover in a future video, but just know that the only way elements are ever going to overlap each other to begin with is if you're using position, relative, or absolute, or if you're using negative margins. So really the reason I bring this up is because let's assume you were using negative margins to create elements overlapping. Don't forget to include position relative. Otherwise your z-index values will just be completely ignored by the browser. So that's a very important note. Always remember that z-index only matters on positioned elements. Cannot stress that enough. That's going to wrap up this video. As always, I hope you feel like you learned something, and thanks for watching. Bye.